All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to our session on a fair vote, rights, responsibilities, and decision making in a democracy. So, here's what the plan for the morning, jam packed morning. We're going to begin with, in a moment, some introductions, go over a little bit about proportional representation and do a simulation, take a look at our resource, answer your questions, and talk about how we want to implement this project. We're going to introduce ourselves. We'll start with Stephen, who you just heard. Stephen?
Yes, hi. Um, my name is Stephen Cohen, and I've been very active, especially since I retired in 2018, in the Fair Vote Canada movement that advocates for proportional electoral systems. At present, I'm Secretary of Fair Vote Toronto, Outreach Team Leader, and the organizer of this curriculum resource project on electoral reform in Canada, which was created in conjunction with the Elementary Teachers of Toronto Union.
Thanks.
Now,
Jordan?
Hello, everyone. My name is Jordan Steenge. I'm currently a TDSB teacher at Gene Lum Public School.
Thanks. Cindy?
Hi, everyone. I'm Cindy Long. I'm coming to you from Thunder Bay, Ontario, which is covered by the Robinson Superior Treaty. I'm an author and a freelance writer. I retired from the Lakehead Board of Education in 2019, and I serve on the board of Fair Vote Canada.
Good morning. My name is Michelle Monk. I am a teacher in the Toronto District School Board, and my current role is math learning partner. And I am excited to have it. I was excited to be part of this team to develop this curriculum on electoral reform. Um, okay, Nigel, can you introduce yourself, please, and say a little bit about how this project came to be?
So good morning, and thank you so much, Michelle, for pulling us all together. I know it's like herding rabbits. I will admit I'm a bit distracted. I'm here with almost 250 of our stewards here at the the um, um, the Don Valley Hotel, where we are going through a day full of training our stewards on many different issues that are facing our members. So my apologies for not being able to stay for the whole event today. My name is Nigel Brief. I'm the vice president of the Elementary Teachers of Toronto, and Michelle and Stephen and I have been like scheming together for such a long time. This is the birth of a dream come true. Look, for me on a personal level, I'm a dad of a 10-year-old. In my opinion, we got to leave this world a better place in which we found it. I believe that first past the post is the root of many of the ills that are going on. That if having if we could have an election format that bases it on the true will of the people, I believe that we would start seeing more investments in public education. I believe we would see more investments in hospitals where we see emergency rooms closing. I think maybe we could have better public transit. Maybe we could finally deal with the climate catastrophe that is happening right now. So and I think that school teachers, all of us, we have a history of doing this work together, of um, emancipatory work. It was the women's movement supported by school teachers that got the women's right to vote. And so, and almost 100 years ago, and right through to civil rights movements, like school teachers have always been on the front line of these kinds of movements. And so this is, working with Michelle, working with Stephen and his team, we are hopeful that this is something that we can start with all of us here, but start spreading it around to other to the rest of our board, and also to other boards across the province, if not across this beautiful country. So again, really glad that you all had this opportunity today. We are Michelle and myself will continue to work on trying to get more releases for more teachers so we can go through this. And I'm really glad you could all make the time today. I know how tough it is as a classroom teacher, leaving your kids, knowing that you're going to go back to to a classroom, you don't know what's going to happen. So thanks again. Have a wonderful day and take care.
And Cindy, you're up. You're going to talk about PR 101.
All right, folks. Well, good morning, and thanks so much for being here. we felt it was necessary to put a little background to this. And so we spend a lot of time in this resource talking about fairness. And kids do have an intrinsic sense of what's fair, and they'll very quickly tell you if they think something isn't fair. If we ask adults what a fair voting system is in a democracy, they might say something along the lines of, well, the government is made up of representatives that the people voted for. And if we use that definition, we can see that in the last Ontario election, the people did not get what they voted for. So this happens repeatedly at the provincial and federal levels in Canada, and we call this a false majority government. And over the years, the Liberals, the NDP, and the Conservatives have all had false majority governments. And sometimes the results are even more distorted. So what you're seeing in this diagram is that only 43% of the votes that were cast for the Progressive Conservative Party, but the Progressive Conservative Party ended up with 64.5% of the seats in the legislature, giving them a full majority government. So they've got 100% of the power with only 43% of the vote. And if we look at the next slide, you can see that the results can be even more distorted than that. So in the 2019 federal election, about 56% of the voters in the GTA chose the Liberals, which is fine. So it was a majority. But the problem is that 100% of the ridings went to the Liberals. Because each riding is a winner-take-all, first-past-the-post vote, the Liberal candidate won the plurality in enough ridings that all the other votes, all those votes for the Conservative, NDP, and Green candidates throughout the GTA might as well have been thrown away. We call them wasted votes. They were counted, but they didn't count for anything. So how this happens, if you look at a race with 4 candidates under first past the post, which is a system that was designed for only 2 parties, and if there's only 2 candidates, first past the post works just fine. But as soon as you have 3 or more, it doesn't. And here's what happens. So in this scenario, Party A would win the riding with only 32% of the vote. You can see those numbers add up to 100. And if that happens in enough ridings, then Party A could win and could form a government, a majority government, with less than a third of voter support. And if you think about that, most people say, well, wait a minute, that's not fair. And even by the age of 10 or 11, I think most human beings can see that that's not fair. So how does this affect teachers in public schools when you get a situation like this? You get a situation where even though fewer than 50% of the Ontarians voted for the PC party, the PCs won a majority of the seats, which means they can ram through or pass any legislation they want, and they don't need the support of any other party, even though only 43% of the voters voted for the PC government. So clearly the voters wanted Liberal, NDP, and Green voices in their government, and there are none. Though they can stand up and shout out things during question period as much as they like. They can speak to the media, they can rail against whatever the government's doing, but in the end, the government can just say, yeah, well, too bad, so sad, we're passing this legislation, because our voting system let them do that. So what's happened since the Ford government came in is that 6.35 billion has been cut from public education, which works out to around 1,500 per student per year. There are 5,000 fewer classroom educators. There's been a 77% increase in school violence. And we've seen Bill 33, the Supporting Children and Students Act, pass, which removes school board trustees and democratic accountability. And all of this has happened, as well as the potential return of police to schools. And all of this because, there's no check and balance, nothing. They can put through this legislation with no opposition at all. And that comes right back to our voting system. However, if we changed our voting system to one of proportional representation, every law that was passed would have to have the support of a parliament that represented a real majority of the voters, a true majority, which means fairer policy decisions for everybody. So how many countries actually use this first past the post voting system? Well, in the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. There are only 3. We use it, it's used in the United States, and it's used in the United Kingdom. And you can see there are a smattering of countries around the world that use it as well. That's it. Everybody else has moved to, ta-da, a system of proportional representation. And in a proportional representation system, what you vote for is what you get. If you get 40% voter support, then you get 40% of the seats in the legislature or in parliament. And proportional representation means that everybody's vote would count. So even if your preferred local candidate did not win in your riding, your vote would still count towards your preferred party. So what proportional representation means is that we could no longer have a false majority government. And what First Past the Post does is it results in really low voter turnout, wasted votes, and partisan hostility, because it drives us towards a two-party system where 2 main parties are battling it out all the time. On the other hand, would increase voter participation, reduce partisan hostility, and most importantly, it would result in fair representation in government. It also results in better outcomes. There's been a lot of studies on this. It results in better outcomes across so many key indicators, including healthcare, the environment, education, and the economic outlook. So in countries that use proportional representation, they're doing better on all those indicators. So proportional representation refers to a family of voting systems that have different features. But another thing about it is that it eliminates the need for strategic voting. So in the last federal election, I did hear a lot of people say, well, I'm usually an NDP voter, or I usually vote Green, but I'm voting Liberal because I don't want, the Conservatives to get in. I did hear that a lot, and as we saw in the last federal election, the NDP was decimated, and of course the Liberals did win. But under a system of proportional representation, you could vote for the party that you actually support, which seems more democratic. And your vote would matter. As I said before, it would always count towards the party that you're supporting. So PR is a family of voting systems. There's no one PR voting system. These are some of the systems that you can have under proportional representation, and some countries have a mix of them. But the basic principle is that the number of seats a party gets in the government reflects the percentage of votes that that party received. Some people have asked me, does PR use ranked ballots? A PR voting system can use a ranked ballot. This is an example of a ranked ballot where you rank your candidates first, second, third, and fourth. But a ranked ballot alone does not necessarily mean that a voting system is proportional. There's a proportional system called single transferable vote that uses ranked ballots, but there's another voting system called alternative vote. It also uses ranked ballots, but it's not a proportional system. And the problem with it is that even though it uses ranked ballots, the analyses have shown that it would distort the results even worse than First Past the Post does. So ranked ballots are just a way of marking a ballot. They're not a voting system. It's how the ranked ballot is used that determines whether or not the system is proportional. And we can see that there's a lot of support for proportional representation across the country and across all political parties. This is the most recent ECOS poll conducted by Fair Vote Canada. They conduct these polls occasionally, and the support for proportional representation ranges between 65 to 80% every time we take the poll. So in summary, a proportional representation voting system would mean that Canadians would get what they voted for, everyone's vote would count, there'd be no more false majority governments, and we'd have better legislation that comes from collaboration instead of conflict, which results in longer lasting policies and more well thought out solutions to problems. And if you want more information on proportional representation voting systems, or any more information about the statistics I mentioned, Fair Vote Canada at fairvote.ca is chock full of information, has everything you might want. And it's also the site you can go to find the resource for grade 5 that this webinar is all about.
Okay, that was really great, Cindy. That was a lot of good information. We're going to take a look at our curriculum resource. Just to give a little bit of background, Nigel kind of set up what happened, but I'll give a little bit of background. A couple of years ago, I can't actually remember when we started, it's been a while, there was a suggestion to create a curriculum resource for grade 5 students to teach about electoral reform and proportional representation. Grade 5, because that is the grade where we learn about government and government systems. And I guess, at least for me, I'll speak for myself, I feel like one of the barriers to changing our electoral system is that we as citizens don't really know what the alternatives are, because we've always used first past the post. It's what we're familiar with. And so it's hard to imagine a different system. So in my case, I thought, well, if kids participate in different systems or learn about them, then they can be the ones to know and to advocate and to share with others about these different alternative systems. So with that in mind, we sat down as a group and we thought about how we could best convey this information to grade 5 students in the government unit. So I'm going to explain a little bit about the structure of the resource. Before that, I just wanted to I found this quote in the Ontario Education Act, and I thought it was kind of perfect. It says, "The purpose of education is to provide students with the opportunity to realize their potential and develop into highly skilled, knowledgeable, caring citizens who contribute to their society." And I think that word citizens is extremely important. We spend a lot of time thinking about our students as future workers and future homeowners, maybe, and other things like that. But I think, for me anyway, that citizenship piece is extremely important. We want our kids to be good citizens as children, and we want them to be good citizens as adults. So I think it's just good to be reminded that citizenship is actually part of our mandate as teachers, according to the Ontario Education Act. Okay, so here is the structure of the resource. It's 3 lessons, and Cindy, Jordan, and I each created a lesson, and we're going to walk you through the lessons. So it's 3-part lessons, and each one has a slide deck attached to it, and we'll each explain how ours works. The first one is, what is democracy? The second one is, what is fair? And then the third one is comparing voting systems and a citizens' assembly. And we'll go through each of those in some detail. Then there's also an appendix that has the handouts and a glossary. And finally, there's a feedback form, which we'll talk about a little later, but we are hoping to get feedback from all of you in how this goes. We're hoping that it is a curriculum resource that you can implement in your classes this year, and we want to hear how it went and what suggestions you have for improving it. So, Jordan.
Yes, hello everybody. So I'm going to be going over the first lesson, and that first lesson is about what is democracy. So this lesson actually has 2 parts, 2 days to it, and each day has a 3-part lesson involved. One is a little bit longer with the simulations. It's this one, and then I'll talk about day 2 later. So just an overview of what it looks like. We have our minds on, which is just an introduction to leaders, just introducing the concept of different leaders in different spaces. Next, we'll be going over 4 simulations of different types of leadership, and that's the meat of it. And then at the end, there's a consolidation piece, which has that exit ticket. And then day 2 is just a brief review of what we've done. The Minds On is reflecting on some famous quotes. Activity is rights versus responsibilities, comparing the 2. And then again, there's an exit ticket at the end. So the beginning of this lesson starts with, we're starting with where the students are at, and they know who maybe a few leaders are. So I have 3 examples here. So that's Principal Trunchbull, that is Mark Carney, and Cleopatra. And this is a great place to use culturally relevant examples to your students. So if your students love hockey, then you could put Austin Matthews, or if they love YouTube, then they could put the YouTube CEO, or different things like that. And the resource goes over, that these leaders are chosen in different ways and are representing different people, right? So, there's Queen or Pharaoh Cleopatra versus Prime Minister Mark Carney and a principal. How are those leaders chosen? Who do they represent, and how that might affect, if they're doing a good job or a bad job or things like that. Just to get them started on understanding leadership and picking leaders. Next, we go into 4 different simulations of leadership. So we use oligarchy, direct democracy, dictatorship, and representative democracy. So our hope is that in going through these different simulations of different like leadership and government styles, students will like learn these definitions and hopefully understand how each system makes them feel and which one makes the most sense for a government. And this connects directly to the Ontario curriculum. The materials you need for the simulation. First, you need stickers or wrapped candies or some goodies. When I ran this, I used some crock gibbets. I used Jolly Ranchers, as was alluded to before, and different things like that. It's nice when they're wrapped because they're gonna be touching hands a lot. So if they're wrapped like a Starburst, that really helps. A key part of this is that the number of resources should not be equal to the number of students or like double their number. So for example, I had a class of 29 students. I wouldn't have 29 stickers because then it's easy to distribute those resources, just giving one to each. It needs to be difficult for the students to make a decision. So, maybe having 35, maybe having less than the number of students. It is totally up to you and what works. Another thing is the students should be in table groups, as this will make it easier for some of the systems. And you might want to use a digital timer. It definitely helps with keeping things going. And within the resource, we have these awesome roll cards for each of the situations. And this would be digitally or on paper. It's totally up to you. Sometimes you can just put a slide up of the roll card, and that works just as well. And then the last part is, as we're going through this experiment, tell the students don't take it personally, right? The simulation will be distributing resources, giving candies to different people. And some students, they might get a little frustrated. Oh, my friend didn't give me the candy for this situation. But, we have those roll cards that are telling the students how to act a certain way and just encouraging them just to understand that it is simulation. Yeah, and you can find these teaching materials in the resource if you go to the teaching materials section for any lesson. So the first one is oligarchy. So an oligarchy is when power is concentrated in the hand of a few powerful people. So the simulation for you in the class would look like randomly selecting leaders. So for example, you might pick a group of friends, right? Or you might pick an entire table group that's sitting together, and they get to pick how to distribute those 29, that number of resources, the candies, and they pick, who to give it to. You can give them the role card, which will help them understand their role, but you can also just remind them that they don't have to give the candies to everybody, and they can give the candies to themselves. I would use a timer as well to just so that the oligarchs, when they're discussing who to give the resources to, they don't get, too into the nitty-gritty details, that they just, how they're feeling to give it out. While the oligarchs are deciding what resources to give out, you might want to have a quiet activity, or you have students that are not the oligarchs just quietly discuss, as if not, when kids have nothing to do, they can get a little loud or distracted. And then, so the next we're moving on to the direct democracy. So this is the one that gets the most chaotic. So you gotta watch out for this one. So this is where all students are involved with the discussion. You want to set a timer for 5 minutes. Maybe I think I gave my class like 7 minutes. I said 5 minutes of discussion and 2 minutes to figure it out. And it will get loud because they all discuss, things might be yelling. I would encourage, as the teacher, your job is to encourage them to have quiet discussions first, maybe on the side, talk to a partner first, and then get them to talk as a group, just so things don't get too chaotic and they have a chance to actually get things done in that time limit. If students can't come to consensus, so 50% plus one vote, half of them are plus one, need to agree on this distribution. And if they don't agree, then say nobody gets anything. And in the 3 classes that I ran this, 2 of them failed, only 1 of them succeeded. So this is kind of the point in understanding that direct democracy can get messy, but hopefully we want them to, hopefully figure something out. And the next one is dictatorship. So here again, you might want to randomly select one leader. All right. And this dictator then decides how to distribute those candies, those crock gibbets, whatever it is. And that dictator, again, you can give them dictator role card, remind them that they don't have to give resources to anybody. They could take it all if they want it. And then have the groups be silent as they are distributed. As the dictator, they get a pick, right? And what happened in some of the simulations I ran is I picked students who the oligarchs didn't treat very well. So those students that maybe didn't get any candies from the oligarchy simulation, they ended up being the dictators. And that, they had a little bit of a chip on their shoulder, and then they didn't give those certain students. So it led to good discussions after. And then the next one is elected representatives. So This one is why they're important to be in table groups. So each table group will get time to discuss to pick a representative for them. Then that representative goes up to the front, and then they discuss with the other table group representatives how to distribute the candies, the resources, whatever you want to call them. Those representatives need to agree, 50% plus one, half of them have to agree with the distribution of those candies. And again, I really use the timer here to limit how long they can discuss, right? Maybe 2 to 3 minutes for the different phases. So that'd be about 4 minutes total. Yeah, so just some things to watch out for in general. One is the time, is because the kids really like to discuss, no, oh, I really wanted this one, I really wanted this one. So setting that timer gives them the limits. And also, in the real world, there's limits on these systems as well, and it helps them understand. Another thing to watch out for, of course, is volume, particularly during the direct democracy, as when all students are involved, they'll get crazy. And then, during an oligarchy or a dictatorship situation, the rest of the class, when they have nothing to do, they might get a little distracted. Another thing to watch out for is hurt feelings. As I said before, sometimes some students can take it a little personally. The next one says people sneaking resources. So for example, they might sneak in and try to eat a candy, right? So I like to count the candies between each simulation just to make sure that all of them are coming back. And then after each simulation, there's a moment for students to reflect. And that's a really good moment just for them to pause and understand, oh, for that one, I didn't really get to say anything. For this one, it was a little confusing or chaotic, right? And I think that's really important part of the process so the students understand, and they'll be using that in their exit tickets. As I said, there's a consolidation at the end. The key things we want the students to know, one, are the different terms here. So they'll get to use those in their exit ticket. So again, that's oligarchy, direct democracy, dictatorship, and representative democracy. And consolidation looks like this. It says, write 4 sentences on which system you like best and why, and give at least one example to support your reasoning. So I gave some sentence starters here that use the vocabulary in it. And we have also created on the next slide a rubric that you might use as a success criteria for that exit ticket. And of course, you might connect it to other grammar concepts that you're doing in class, something maybe you need to work on, capitals and periods, whatever it is. There's also a good connection with French. Maybe you're connecting it to, using opinion words or things like that. And you can base that on the grammar chart from the curriculum, which is also on the next slide. And it looks like this, right? So if you look at the grade 5, so you can see the different concepts that they need to work on. And then you can pick one that works with whatever you're doing. So this is just one part of that table, but there's many more. And then we go into day 2. So day 2 is just a brief review, and then we go on to the different sections, as I mentioned earlier. Nice. So we start by reviewing from the past day, and you can have students share what they learned on what they talked about on their exit ticket. You might want to use an anchor chart to share about the different feelings that people were having in different situations, and which ones that people liked and tended not to like and why. So some examples from when I did this with my classes were, people felt very slighted after they were not given resources before. The dictator used this time to get back at those people. People felt that direct democracy didn't work because everyone was yelling and it was too loud. Those were things that different people shared. And then the real lesson for day 2 starts with a quick quote reflection. So there are 2 quotes you can pick from. You can put up both or just pick one. So the first one, dictatorships are one-way streets, democracies boast two-way traffic. And the second one, with great power comes great responsibility. And this is from Uncle Ben from Spider-Man, or from different characters in Spider-Man. And this is all about starting a discussion about when you're given this awesome power of democracy, this awesome power to vote and be civically engaged, it is your responsibility to also be a part of it, right? It is not, dictatorships just have that one-way street, but democracies allow us to also, put our input in. And when we don't, then our democracies, they don't work. And that leads to our discussion on rights and responsibilities. So this is directly connected to the curriculum as well in Ontario. So this is what the slides look like. So it'll start with having, voting. And then the section in red is actually hidden behind an animation. And then you're going to ask students, so would you say this is a right or a responsibility and why? And then they might have an answer to, you might do a think, pair, share. And then afterwards, the animation will reveal the answer that this is a right. And it might give a little bit of context. So these are the ones that are in the slideshow, but you can always add more or take away more, whatever works best for what you're discussing in class and things like that. And then it talks about the connections between them. So how are all these connected? So each of these arrows, there's an animation behind them, but you can add your own or just discuss it as a class. So for example, the right to vote, right? It's important that that's connected to participating democracy, which is an example of your free speech, right? All these things, they rely on one another. And then when we get to our exit ticket, which is the next slide, we can talk about what would happen if one of them was gone, right? There is an awesome picture of different people using their rights and responsibilities, such as protesting, and that can be put up on the screen as students reflect on what would happen if one of these was gone, right? So what would happen if you didn't have that freedom of speech? What would happen if people didn't improve on their community? Yeah, and then just a brief overview of the assessments from this lesson is, conversations at the beginning. So you might be checking with students as they're doing their writing for their exit ticket, and definitely during, those group discussions. Observation, again, as I was talking about those group discussions after, each simulation, or group discussions during the rights and responsibilities. And the hard products are those exit tickets that you can find in the slideshow or in the appendix. So thanks so much for listening to this first section.
Great. Okay, thank you. So now Cindy will provide an overview of lesson 2, which is called What is Fair? So over to you, Cindy.
Thanks, Michelle. Both these first two lessons do support or lead towards the third lesson, which I think is kind of the meat dish of this menu. So in the second lesson, students take a closer look at what is fair. And I didn't really divide it into days or time because I know from my own experience that you have to be pretty flexible in a classroom. And sometimes maybe one day you only have 20 minutes for something and another day you have 45 and you're never sure how's your class behaving that day, what else is going on. So I mean you can do this lesson in whatever pieces or time increments make the most sense for you. The overview is that it has two parts to it. And in the first part, the students do a little voting simulation under first past the post. They create a list of criteria for fairness, and then they analyze some scenarios to see if they meet the criteria that they've come up with as a class. If your class has already spent some time at the start of the year talking about fairness in some way, you might be able to skip some of this too. It all depends on your class and what you've already done. In part 2, the students look at 3 case studies from Canada and Ontario, and then decide again, based on that criteria for fairness that they established in part 1, do these situations seem fair to them? And then they have an opportunity to suggest ways to increase the fairness if they don't think it's fair. So for a simulation, we often do pizza with classes, and students are told, hey, if we were going to order a pizza and you've got a choice of 4 toppings and you can only vote for one topping, which one would you vote for? So when you're coming up with your pizza toppings for choices, try to make them all fairly popular so that the vote's going to get split, okay? Don't make one topping that's probably nobody's going to choose, or this won't work for you. So in a class of 27, you might get results that look like this. I'm hoping you get something that looks like this. If it doesn't, you'll have to wing it a bit. So under first past the post, pepperoni would be declared the winner, and everyone gets a pepperoni pizza, even though most of the class, in this case, 15 people, did not want pepperoni. So even though most people wanted something different, is it fair that everybody's going to have to eat a pepperoni pizza? Why or why not? So this gets into, without even mentioning our voting system at all, this gets into the idea of fairness under a first past the post voting system. Should a winner have at least 50% of the vote? So if you do, however, get a clear majority winner, maybe nearly everybody votes for cheese, you can pivot around and ask whether the wishes of the minority matter. Is it fair that 2 people that don't like cheese, or maybe who can't eat cheese, maybe they have a dairy problem, is it fair that they have to eat a cheese pizza? And what would make it more fair? So you can fool around with this a bit depending on the results you get. Most of the time you do get a false majority win, and so the point is made. But if you don't, you figure it out, you come up with something. So this is when, after you do the simulation with the pizza, this is when the students brainstorm the criteria for fairness, and you have to record the responses somehow. How you do that is up to you, but because you're going to be referring to it throughout the lesson, it's important to have it either on a slide that you can keep going back to, or perhaps record it on chart paper and post it in the room for the duration, just so that you can keep pointing to it and saying, well, what about this? This is what you decided. So the students might come up with criteria like this. They might come up with different things, whatever they come up with. As long as everybody agrees it's a good criteria for fairness, that can be your list. So after this, you're going to want to get them up and moving around a bit. So you can put 4 printed cards around the room, everything from fairest to really unfair. And students will be exposed to several different scenarios. And for each one, they'll move to the spot in the room that reflects their feelings about that scenario. They might all move to the same spot, in which case there's not much discussion, or they might not all move to the same spot. And this is when you can ask them to justify their choices and get a discussion going about why they think it's fair or why they think it's unfair. So in the actual lesson in the slideshows, I included, I think, I'm trying to remember now, but I think there's about 4 or 5 slides that have, there's 5. I said it right there on the screen. There are 5 slides that it's really pretty cut and dried whether the situation is fair or not. Your class isn't going to need to have much discussion about it. So depending on your class and what you want to do, you could use those slides. But if you want there to be more uncertainty, if you want there to be more discussion about whether or not the scenario is fair, I recommend slides 11 to 13 instead. You don't have to use them all. You could just use one from slides 6 to 10 and one from slides 11 to 13. You can use as many or as few as you want. If you think your class is really getting the point, just use a couple of them. If you think your class needs more time to explore this, you can use a lot of them. I'll show you an example in the next slide of one of the scenarios on which there won't be any disagreement. So this is one of the really simple ones. And pretty much everybody in the class is going to say, yeah, that's fair. And there's not going to be a lot of room for discussion about whether it's fair or not. You could even refer back to your criteria and say, well, which parts of our criteria for fairness does this meet? And then in the next slide, there's an example of one of the scenarios that it's a little more complex. So, new playground equipment, crowded school, though, not everybody can use it every day. So the principal makes this rule. How fair is the rule that the principal makes? So this one will generate more discussion, and students will probably have differing opinions on whether this is fair or how fair it is. And again, you can refer back to the criteria and get a discussion about the fairness of this going. Okay. Finally, in part 2, which might take place the next day or 2 days later, I don't know how your schedule is for social studies. Students will take the fairness components that they've considered in part 1, and they're going to look at some real situations that we have in Ontario and Canada. And I'm going to say right off the bat that it was challenging to find information that seemed at a grade 5 developmental level. That's something we want to hear about in the feedback. If this isn't working for your students, we might need something else. So students are going to look at a bar graph comparing vote percentage to seat win in an Ontario election. They're going to look at a collection of facts about the composition of our federal government by age, ethnicity, and gender. And they're going to look at a line graph that shows what's been happening to voter turnout over time in Ontario. They're going to look at this bar graph. So there's the vote, there's the seat summary from the Ontario general election. So you might have to explain the difference between votes and seats too. This is a good time to explain that to your class. How does it work that you get, that governments win or parties win a riding and that gives them a seat in the government? And there's more information in the slideshow about this than I'm showing here. But kind of you can see that somebody didn't get 50% of the vote, but they got more than 50% of the seats. So hopefully it's obvious to the class that this isn't really fair on some level. And you can also see you can also see how little the Greens and NDP got compared to their vote share. Look at the Liberal and NDP vote share in that election and look at the seats that they got. So there'll have to be a little bit of teacher intervention here to point out a few things to the class. And the next slide looks at some statistics. In Canada, the fact that our MPs tend to be older white males. In this one part just looks at age. And then there's a few more. The representation of women in our parliament. Ethnicity. MPs do tend to be white in Canada. They're more likely to be male. Kind of ties into the second one. The representation of Indigenous people. And finally, the representation from the LGBTQ plus community. You can show as many of these or as few of these as you want. You can show them all. You don't have to show them all. They're there, and students can decide again based on that criteria they came up with for fairness in the first part of the lesson. Do these things seem fair? So it always comes back to, is this fair? And then the third graphic they look at is the voter turnout. You know, does it seem fair that only 43% of the eligible voters are determining who has the power in our government? And, you know, why has it gone down so much? You know, it's interesting questions there. Wrapping it up, when the students are going through the 3 case studies, they're going to be filling in a worksheet that's in the appendix of the document and on the slideshow. And they can share their thoughts with the class about what might have been fair or unfair in those situations, offer their opinions about what might make an unfair situation more fair, what might have to change. And there is also an exit ticket at the end where students explain what fairness means to them and give an example of something that they thought was fair and something they thought wasn't fair, depending on the type of evaluation you do. What you observe in their oral responses will help you with your assessment.
Our hope is that through lesson 1 and 2, kids will start thinking about what are different models of government, what makes something fair, how can we make sure that the government is representing what people need and want. So we hope that this has started that ball rolling, and now we're going to get a little bit more into the actual voting process. We wanted to make sure, we wanted to give everyone a bit of a feeling for how the structure of the curriculum, and maybe address things that might come up. We are about to do the third and final lesson, the culmination of all the learning so far, which is comparing voting systems and a citizens' assembly. And I will explain a little bit more about what a citizens' assembly is. And as I go, please feel free to pop your questions in the chat, or unmute as we explain. Okay, so the lesson starts off, and as Cindy did, I didn't actually break mine into days, but it will take several days to complete this portion, the third lesson. It starts with a quick simulation of a first past the post election. So students each have a roll card that's at either hockey or golf. The majority of the roll cards are hockey. There's a minority that are golf. It's a very straightforward 2 candidate election. So in the town of Northville, there is a proposal to build some new sports infrastructure. And there's a question about whether it should be a hockey arena or a golf course. So there's lots of debate in the town, and then there's an election, and Harry Hockey is running, and he really wants to build a hockey arena, and Gary Golf wants to build a golf course, and they're competing for votes. So the students in the class each get a roll card that says if they prefer hockey or golf, and then they get a ballot that says, do you vote for Harry? Do you vote for Gary? So they each vote according to what they feel, and it's set up so that hockey wins a clear majority. I can't remember exactly the ratio, but it's set up so that hockey wins and Gary loses. Then that's round 1. And then in round 2, we have another version of what might happen, which is we have 3 candidates. We have Harry Hockey, we have Helen Hockey, and we have Gary Golf. So we have these 3 candidates. And in this scenario, people on their roll cards have either a white background or a gray background. And if they have a white background, they vote for Harry Hockey. If they have a gray background, they vote for Helen Hockey, and the golf is just 1. But what happens is the vote is split between Harry and Helen, and actually Gary wins. So even though the majority of people prefer hockey, Gary Golf wins because the vote is split between the 2 hockey candidates. So it's just a very hands-on and quick example of what happens in a first past the post election. And then there's some conversation to debrief what happened. There's an excellent series of videos that use voting, like this kind of simulation in the animal kingdom of looking at different voting systems. And it actually really, really nicely explains the different voting systems. So these are screenshots from that video. And in this case, there's an election of all of the different animals vote. And the cheetah wins, oh, sorry, the leopard wins, but the leopard only has 20% of the vote, but they win because they have a majority. So then there's a conversation about, is that fair? Is that unfair? We can talk about our criteria from last time. So students will probably say it's unfair because many votes don't count. 80% of people did not want the leopard, and yet the leopard still won. And then we go into some other examples of what's wrong with first past the post. So as we mentioned earlier, lots of people don't bother to vote, especially youth. So in fact, more than half of 18 to 24-year-olds don't vote. This is the estimated turnout by age group. I believe this was in not this year's federal election, but the previous one. And we can see that among 21 to 24-year-olds and even 18 to 21-year-olds, there is very, very low voter turnout, which means that the government isn't really representing what young people want because they're not voting. Another thing that's wrong with first past the post is there's a trash talking of other candidates, these negative campaigns. So this is also from those Animal Kingdom videos. Vote gorilla or leopard will eat you. Vote leopard or gorilla will throw poo at you. There's this very antagonistic campaigns. And I just wanted to share this video that I very recently saw. I thought it was very appropriate, that in alternatives to first past the post, campaigns are not necessarily that negative. And I'm just going to play this video in a second. So in these negative campaigns, people are attacking the individual and not the issues. Very timely. I wanted to share this very short video. On the left here is the new mayor of New York City, Zohran Mamdani. And then we have here Robert Lander, this is just a very quick background. The vote for New York City mayor was first past the post, but the vote for the primaries, who was running for each party, used a ranked choice ballot, which, as we said, is not necessarily proportional, but it does lead to more positive campaigns. So I just wanted to play this because I feel like this is a new system in the New York primaries. And so there's still a lot of public education that has to happen around how do you even operate a ranked ballot in a way that makes sense. So I'm going to play this.
Hey!
Hey, good morning.
How's it going?
Please go second.
No, I insist you go second.
How about I go first and you go second?
Well,
We both love New York City.
and that's why it's so important to not send scandal-ridden, corrupt Andrew Cuomo to City Hall.
New Yorkers deserve so much better than a disgraced creep.
Agreed.
Zohran, you've done a remarkable job building a historic grassroots campaign for a New York City all New Yorkers can afford.
Brad, you've been a principled, progressive leader in our city for years.
Early voting starts tomorrow, and we both know what we need to do to save our city from Andrew Cuomo. You want to tell him?
You go first.
Nah, you go first.
Let's do it together. We're cross-endorsing.
In New York City, we have ranked choice voting. That means you can rank up to 5 candidates for mayor.
Brad and I are officially telling our supporters.
Rank
I'm
me
your
number one, rank
rank
Zohran
Brad
number 2. Let's send Andrew Cuomo.
Back to the suburbs.
I just thought that was such a good example of that idea of how people can work together in this positive, collaborative way in a campaign where people have multiple choices. It's so much less aggressive and less divisive and more collaborative. Okay, some other things that are wrong with first past the post that lesson 3 talks about. There's less diversity, as we mentioned. Here's 2 graphs comparing gender representation in Canada compared to gender representation in Parliament. The outcomes might not reflect the population's diversity, even though half the voters are women, less than a quarter of elected representatives are women. Yeah, so that's been an ongoing concern. So this is all setting up what is wrong with first past the post. And then the premise is set for a citizens' assembly. And I'm just going to show a short video about what a citizens' assembly is and how it works. And then we'll talk about how that's carried out in your classroom.
What is a National Citizens Assembly on electoral reform? Citizens' assemblies are a new way for people to have a voice in decision-making. Citizens' assemblies bring together a diverse group of everyday people to learn, discuss, and make recommendations. A citizens' assembly is a way of bringing public wisdom into the discussion of electoral reform. It is unlike any other institution you've ever seen. Citizens' assemblies use random selection to choose participants, like a jury. This means that members look like the population in terms of age, gender, education, and other characteristics. Members come from all across Canada, rural and urban, coast to coast to coast. Citizens' assemblies are not filled with activists and professionals, but with everyday people. The members of the assembly spend time learning from experts and interest groups with different views about electoral reform and what should happen. Members have the opportunity to ask difficult questions and compare different ideas. Members then talk about what they have heard and work together to produce proposals and recommendations. These recommendations are delivered in a report to Parliament. They help our elected representatives do the important work of making democracy fairer for all of us. Learn more at nationalcitizensassembly.ca.
Okay, so that is a background of Citizens Assembly. So here's what happens in the final part of lesson 3. So there's this context provided. As more and more people have raised concerns about first past the post, the Ontario government has realized that the system is not as fair as it should be. The government has invited you, a diverse group of citizens, to make some recommendations about how our elections should work. So now the class has become the randomly selected participants of a Citizens Assembly, and they will go through the steps of the Citizens Assembly. The lesson summarizes for the students the different voting systems. So the two families of voting systems are winner take all, which is not proportional, and proportional. So these two systems are like this. The winner take all, this is what we currently have, or what we have is an example of a winner take all system, or we have a proportional counterexample. And winner take all could be first past the post, could be ranked ballot, and a proportional system could be mixed member proportional or single transferable vote, which is what that Irish video was. So just to give a little bit of context for the students. Winner take all elects a single winner, and proportional representation elects multiple winners. All right, so here are the steps of the Citizens Assembly, and this is actually what the steps are in an official Citizens Assembly, and then we model it within our class. So there's the learning phase at the beginning where the citizens are learning about the different systems, and then there's a listening phase. I'll explain each of these in a second. There's a deliberation phase, and then the recommendation phase. In the learning phase, so students are put into groups. You can decide if you want them to choose their groups or if you want to choose random or however you want to do it. So when they're in groups, they're each assigned a voting system. And depending on the size of your class, you might have some repeats because just to make things a bit simpler and to have reasonable group size. So the first stage, they're learning. Then the groups present. So they present different voting systems. So the first phase, they're doing some research. We provide some videos and some articles for them to read. They will need some support from teachers to understand what the different systems are. So it's helpful. One of the reasons we wanted to give you a sense of these systems is so that you can help guide this process. The second phase, the groups are presenting their voting systems, and they have to consult with someone from outside the group to expand the representation because the class is not diverse in age. We say, okay, well, if you want really to be diverse, you need to ask somebody outside of the class their opinion. So you can choose a sibling or a parent, caregiver, another teacher, a coach, somebody from outside, what they think, because we want to bring in that diverse representation. Then the next phase is deliberation. So there's a discussion of the voting systems, and this is done both in jigsaw and whole group. So in the jigsaw phase, if you have 4 different groups, there's a member of each of the 4 groups that comes together and actually tries to talk about the different voting systems and how they work. And then finally, there's the recommendation phase. So the final phase is ideally, as a class, people decide which 1, 2, or 3 systems should be brought to the citizens of Ontario. And you can have them create a poster. And then the final part is an individual reflection. And just a little bit more about the Citizens Assembly, there are some slide templates. So the slide templates say, give a summary of the system, what a ballot looks like, what are some pros and cons. So each group is presenting a little bit about each of the systems, and then they hash it out, they discuss it, and then they decide as a group, facilitated by the teacher what are 1, 2, or 3 systems that they agree should be brought to the citizens of Ontario. And then after that, there's an individual journal reflection. So, which voting system do you think is best for Ontario? Do you agree with the rest of the class? So, we don't want to say that the whole class has to agree. People can have their own opinion. Do you think Ontario should change its voting system? So, in a citizens' assembly, participants normally can talk to experts. What is one question you would want to ask an expert? So, just thinking about that. So, that's the final individual reflection piece. Okay, in terms of assessment, there we also have a triangulation of assessment that you can consider. So, in terms of conversation, you can report or check in with your students as they develop their citizens assembly presentation. You can observe, so their participation in the jigsaw and the whole group discussion. And then there are several products. So this portion of the curriculum is really the most labor intensive for students. They are putting together this citizens assembly presentation. So they have to do some independent research with the resources that we provide. They have to create slides. They have to present it orally. They will have to consult with somebody outside of the class as part of their homework. And then they have to make a recommendation to the citizens of Ontario. And then there's the individual journal reflection. So obviously it's up to you which of these components you include. Actual citizens assembly presentation will take some preparation in terms of, you know, learning and presenting, and these are the concepts are tricky. I mean, I'm not saying they're above their heads, but for them to understand really what does first past the post mean, what does single transferable vote mean, for them to really understand, they'll need to do some real thinking and learning about that. Okay, the last part of the curriculum resource, there's a glossary for teachers with some of the vocabulary that comes up. We know that there's some terminology that might be new or unfamiliar for teachers, so there's a glossary. So yeah, so we wanted to talk about some of the ideas of going beyond the resource. So as Nigel said at the beginning, this is the ideas that we're presenting here. We want them to go beyond just what happens in their, this one unit of social studies. We hope that students will start to think about all the ways that our first past the post system can be limiting, and maybe can be changed. And so here are just some ideas about how you can introduce more fair voting systems into your classroom and school. And I'm going to get Jordan to say a little bit about this first one.
Yeah, so let's say you're picking a movie for, Halloween that just passed by, and there are, 3 or 4 options. Instead of having students have, 1 vote per student, what you can do is change it to say, vote for whichever movie you're okay with or you would want to watch, and allow students to have more than 1 vote, right? And what this does, students might vote for, 3 or 4 of the movies, but it allows for the system to create a choice that more of the students are okay with and more students will enjoy, instead of potentially having, 1 movie that, a lot of students or, a small number of students are really passionate about, and then the other one splitting the vote. And that would make everybody feel more included and feel like they have a voice when it comes to picking for a movie.
Okay, thanks. Another idea that I think this actually was a suggestion from Dave Meslin about student council elections. I think student council operates differently in different places, but one great way for kids to actually practice democracy in their school is with a student council election. And I think student council elections lend themselves really nicely to some of these alternative systems because they're all multi-part or multi-seat, right? There's always many seats in the student council. And so you could quite easily put in place a proportional system or a not first past the post system in your student council election, or even play around with different systems. You could do a ranked ballot. You could do, there's all kinds of options. But one cool thing, I think, if you're in a K-6 or even K-8 school, if you have your grade 5s who just learned all this stuff about government, about voting, they could actually be the ones to run the student council election based on what the recommendations were, and that would be a great way for them to apply what they just learned to actually implementing democracy in their school. So I just wanted to say, and this is my side project, that my next project maybe is to create a resource for schools about how to run different kinds of elections, because I think we all often just do first past the post because it's what we know, but I think it would be a great opportunity to introduce other systems. Some other examples of how you can bring in alternatives in your at school, creating opportunities for participatory democracy in your classes. So finding opportunities or op, ways, mechanisms for kids to participate in decision making, and then also talking to colleagues. So as adults talking to colleagues about this, as Cindy mentioned earlier on, we want this kind of groundswell, this pressure on government. And I think if people aren't familiar with voting systems and voter and electoral reform, it's not going to change. But that's part of, if we talk about our role as citizens, as adults, we can think about how that can have an impact.
There we go. Okay, so can you see the resource or can you see a ton of other stuff too? Okay, so that's the cover, obviously. And then as you scroll down, so there's a little forward, introduction, line of the 3 lessons, links to the Fair Vote Canada website, links to our feedback page, and then we get right into it. Looks kind of like this. We give you the curriculum connections and all the other things you expect. And then we get into the teaching materials, and you'll notice there is a slideshow. And when you click on the slideshow, it should take you straight to and I'm afraid to do it in case I can't get back to this document, but it will take you to the slideshow that goes with that lesson. And so for people, someone asked in the chat about the slides, and they're all in there. Or it will take you to the appendix. If you need the written reflection rubric, it will take you there. And so you've got your lesson 1, you've got your lesson 2. And again, when you get down to the teaching materials, we've noted everything you might need and we've provided links to it. You get into your lesson 3. And then after we get through the lessons and all the links, and Michelle has some fantastic videos that you can use with your class. All linked there. And then there's like a sample of what the appendixes look like. So you've got your check brick for the written reflection for the first lesson and the roll cards that you need. A sample of the exit ticket. These are photocopyable, the cards you need for lesson 2, unless you just want to make your own. The student worksheets, again, the exit ticket, and then the cards you'll need for lesson 3 for the voting and the ballots and everything that's referred to. So it all should be there. And the glossary that Michelle referred to, and a feedback form, which we really want to get from you. We really want to hear how this went and what needs to be better. And of course, just the credits page. So that's basically the what the resource looks like. And it will be available on the Fair Vote Canada website. If you go to Teacher Resources, it will be available there.
Thanks, Cindy. We're going to talk a little bit about feedback in a minute. We're going to I will email the PDF of this resource, which has all the links in it by the end of the week. We'll send it out to you. And of course, feel free to share. It will also be posted on the Fair Vote Canada website under curriculum resources. So we're happy for anybody to use it. Jordan, you want to talk about this?
Yes. The most of the slides, we have a French copy. It's just not quite up to date, so it might take us a little while, but the French copy is coming. The document we showed, the PDF, the resource for you will still be in English, but all the student-facing materials, we will have that French copy coming.
The videos that we shared are also in English. I haven't found great examples of videos in French that are French immersion accessible. You can, if anyone finds examples of good videos in French, that would be great too, if you want to share them with us. Okay. So there is a feedback form that has some questions in it, and we hope that if you do try it out, you can give us some of your feedback. In addition, we are hoping to have a feedback session in May. We have to see if we can get release time, or if people want to meet very briefly, maybe for like half an hour after school one day, just to share how it went and talk about it with each other. Okay. And then if you would like to know more, I thought we would share a few resources that you can consider. So I already mentioned the book Teardown by Dave Meslin. Fair Vote Canada was mentioned about that there are many resources there that explain different voting systems. And I also wanted to share this one, To Build a Better Ballot, which uses coding and different kind of visual representations to look at how the different ballots work and how different voting systems work. Cindy, do you want to talk about the other two on the slide?
The Politics of Voting by Dennis Pilon. It can be a bit dense in places, but it has some really excellent information about the different systems, how they work. And also, one thing I really liked about it was he looks at some of the myths about our first past the post system, and he shows why they are myths, and he takes those myths apart quite carefully. And for instance, one thing you hear all the time is, oh, well, first past the post results in, more majority governments, which are stronger and can get more done. And it turns out that's just not true. It's not true at all. As a matter of fact, most of our elections seem to result in minority governments. And the difference between the amount of legislation that's passed in a majority versus a minority is negligible. Sometimes it's the same. So we have these myths that are floating around and that people will toss at you if you're talking about it, but they are that exactly. They're myths. The Crisis of Canadian Democracy is a new book out just this year by Andrew Coyne. Got it out of the library and I just devoured it. And so I went out and bought a copy because I know I'll be referring to it again and again. Andrew really makes the case for not just changes to our electoral system, but things that need to change in general in Canadian governance if we want to keep a democracy in Canada, if we don't want to devolve into the kind of almost insanity we're seeing in our neighbor to the south. By the way, even the UK is starting to consider changing their voting system, and we inherited that voting system from the UK as a colony of England. And they're even starting to look at changing their system. Pretty soon, the US might be the only Western democracy that uses first past the post for very good reasons. So I highly recommend Andrew Coyne's book. It's pretty accessible. It's a little more accessible than The Politics of Voting, and he does use a fair bit of humor in it as well.
Sorry, I just wanted to clarify about To Build a Better Ballot. To Build a Better Ballot uses basically coding and math to look at how representative different systems are of the majority. And I will add the link to that when we share it.
Yeah, I'm just here to again to say thank you. To leave your classes, and teachers, they might not have a supply, but to do that and understand that you're doing important work by being here, not just for your students and for yourself, but as a citizen, as Michelle talked about earlier. And we really, really appreciate it. And if you have any questions, you can email us, and we appreciate that feedback form. And hopefully we'll get to talk to some of you in May. So thank you so much for being here.